Hey kiddies, it's Triple Feature Tuesday once again, and this week we're looking at my favorite Wes Craven movies. Yes, unfortunately Wes Craven passed away last week, coincidentally with my cat, but completely unrelatedly. I'm going to miss Lucius probably more than Wes Craven. But since Lucius never made any movies, we're going to look at the Wes Craven movies that I like the best. I might actually have a couple other Wes Craven themed triple features coming up since I kept thinking about them and decided to go with this one. Because we're looking at the man and the movies that affected me the most. You can, look at the movies that affected you the most in your film series, but in the meantime, we're going to look at mine. Our menu is going to include Red Eye, Scream, and of course, A Nightmare on Elm Street. What's fun about this triple feature is we're going to be going in reverse chronological order, where we're starting with the newest film that I liked of his and going backwards to the first one. Red Eye is a suspense thriller starring Rachel McAdams and Cillian Murphy, and it's not a traditional horror like Wes Craven was known for. It's more Hitchcockian because the bulk of the movie takes place on an airplane, and then the climax takes place in Rachel McAdams' father's house. But the whole time Wes is building suspense through the tension of having this not necessarily crazy person, but a person that is willing to kill you to get what they want, and you can't escape from him. He is literally sitting next to you on an airplane. There is nowhere to go. There is no one there that can help you. And we see Rachel McAdams try to do everything she can to not do what the guy wants, and then eventually has to figure out other ways around it. It's really, really good. It's very low-key because, suspense on an airplane. But it doesn't get boring, which is impressive because we're just in that location for about 2/3 or 3/4 of the movie, and during that we're pretty much just looking at these two people talking for the whole time. And one, they're just great. This was the first time I ever really saw Rachel McAdams in anything because I'm a man and predominantly don't have a girlfriend, so I've still never seen The Notebook. And Cillian Murphy I had liked since 28 Days Later, even though I have mixed feelings towards that movie, but he is always a good time, and when he does his American accent, it's just so easy for him to go creepy with it, and he plays it well. And what's impressive is that even though it's just the straight-up suspense thriller, when it does get to the third act of the film, where it becomes a very low-key action movie, both Rachel McAdams and Cillian Murphy are just good at it. Like, they're a believable threat to each other without trying to go overblown and giant action movie. But it's a great highlight to Wes's skill as a director. When he's doing horror movies, it's always hard to tell how good a director is, because so much of it is just a scare. You don't have to necessarily be the greatest filmmaker as long as you've got something on the screen or a music cue that will scare you. Suspense is tough because you have to not only get your audience to buy in to the premise, but you have to sustain that premise for the entire length of the movie, and Wes is able to do that in one location with two people for 90 minutes. Then we go a decade previous with Scream. This was Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson's reinvention of horror for the 90s. By that point, horror was kind of, as is the cycle, horror was lagging in box office sales again. And then they came up with Scream, which is a horror movie, but kind of turns the whole genre on its head. Think Cabin in the Woods, which, Cabin in the Woods would not be possible without Scream coming before it. But done with in the 90s, and more specifically just a slasher movie, where you have serial killer or mass murderer. It's hard to tell. Mass murderers always end up serial killers at the end of the movie when you find out what the actual motivation is. Either way, there is a guy going around in a ghost face costume that you can buy anywhere. It is literally the ghost face costume that you could have bought in stores beforehand, before it became the Scream costume. Going around calling people up and sort of torturing them with their love of horror movies and turning that against them. What's a lot of fun is how much Wes is poking fun at existing horror movies. Not only just in general, but a lot of the times he's making jokes specifically about his. Drew Barrymore says that she liked the first Nightmare on Elm Street, but all the other ones stunk, which Wes Craven didn't really have much to do with any of them. He co-wrote number 3, or at least co-wrote the story that number 3 was based on, and then made New Nightmare, but otherwise he didn't have anything to do it. And Wes actually has a cameo as the janitor at the high school, Fred, and he is wearing the original Freddy Krueger outfit with the fedora and the red and green sweater with the solid red sleeves. Rewatching it, it works better as just a metatextual movie than it does a horror movie because, I mean, it's just not that scary. And this may be a function of I watched a lot more horror movies after Scream than I did before Scream. It's still really a lot of fun, and I enjoy it a lot. I love the performances. Neve Campbell is a pretty good final girl. Courtney Cox is great. I love Jamie Kennedy in it before, Jamie Kennedy became Jamie. It's really funny when, in terms of metatextual stuff, like how deep or how many levels Wes will go with it. I love watching the scene where Randy, Jamie Kennedy's character, is yelling at the TV screen. He's watching Halloween. He's yelling at Jamie Lee Curtis to look behind her so that she doesn't get killed by Michael Myers. Meanwhile, Ghostface is behind Randy. Randy being played by Jamie Kennedy. So he's just going, Jamie, look behind you! And the audience, if they knew his name, would be saying, Jamie, look behind you too. First or second introduction to Matthew Lillard and the crazy, silly white guys that he plays. First time I ever got to see Skeet Ulrich. Never needed to really see him again. First time I saw Rose McGowan. She was a keeper. Actually, most of these people are keepers. Jamie, Randy, Drew, keepers. Neve, yeah, I like Neve. Ghostface is a pretty good design. He holds up. I still enjoy him. He's on my slasher shelf. Always wonderful. Scream, not necessarily great horror movie, but still just a great movie, and I still enjoy watching it. Oddly enough, I've never watched any of the sequels. I always thought that the whole movie kind of loses its point if you actually turn it into a horror movie franchise, and so I never got around to them, so I can't speak to them. Which is odd, because I am just a sucker for sequels. I love horror movie franchises. It's weird. I guess I respect Scream too much. Finally, we have Nightmare on Elm Street. Oh my god, cannot understate how important this movie was to me. First horror movie I ever saw when I was very, very small. I had older friends, they wanted to watch it. My mom was like, yeah, sure, watch it, it's on cable. Had nightmares for 3 months. Didn't watch another horror movie till I was about 12 or 13, and it was on regular TV, and was heavily edited, and was, of course, a Nightmare on Elm Street sequel, because Freddy Krueger. Fascinating. If nothing else, Wes Craven helped create Freddy Krueger. And honestly, that's probably going to end up being the strongest part of his legacy. And what a thing to do. I mean, I just think he's fantastic. You can see the Freddy Krueger section in the background. He just has his own section with Jason and Ash. But Freddy Krueger, one of the scariest things ever, because you can't escape from sleeping and your dreams. And Wes was brilliant in designing it. Just the burned face, the sweater that is difficult to look at. Red and green are difficult for the eye to process simultaneously, so he's hard to look at in his face in the sweater. The gloves, such a signature weapon, because I mean, slashers usually they just find something, and you can get a preference for it, but you find it and you go with it. You see Freddy craft his murder weapon in the opening credits of the film, and can't understate how smart Wes was to know to cast an actor. Usually, you just get a stuntman to play your slasher, and he lumbers around and he does the thing. Wes knew to put an actor in there, Robert Englund, a great character actor who could just be scary and do stuff with the eyes, because that was the only thing that was really visible of him. Everything else is covered up. Nightmare on Elm Street is just scary. It's still scary. 30 years later, it is still a disturbing movie. And part of that is just the actual violence and the slasher stuff that you never know where he's going to be coming from when you fall asleep. But what makes Wes Craven Nightmare on Elm Street movies better, and you see this to a lesser extent in his New Nightmare, is that Wes doesn't let you know when the characters are dreaming. They will just kind of wander around, and all of a sudden you have to figure it out. In all of the later films, it's much, much more obvious when the transition happens, and Wes disguises it, and that helps make the ending of it that much more creepy and or open-ended. Up to that point, Wes had mainly been doing exploitation movies. Like, he had great success with Last House on the Left and the Hills Have Eyes movies. But this was such a more cerebral horror movie, which Wes Craven was a really, really smart guy. He had undergraduate degrees in English and psychology, and then got his master's in both philosophy and writing. And you can see all the influences of that in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Just the literary nature. It's such a good story and character arc for Nancy. You get, like, final girls end up sort of stumbling into facing the bad guy at the end, but you get to see Nancy really build and develop and then go after Freddy purposefully, which is part of why Nancy is the greatest final girl. I'm sorry, Lori. You're like the best, the best, the first best one, but Nancy Thompson all the way for me. Just the psychological tricks he's pulling in terms of what is reality, what is not, which ties into philosophy. It just, Nightmare on Elm Street cannot understate how impressive a movie it is. Not just in terms of how scary it is, but it is a clever, clever movie. And you should stop what you're doing when you're done and watch this. Watch A Nightmare on Elm Street on Netflix, because it's on Netflix. As is Scream, you can watch that one. Red Eye is not, which is a little weird since it wasn't the biggest hit, so you'd think it would be there. And also, A Vampire in Brooklyn is on there, which I couldn't, in good conscience, put as one of the 3 movies on this triple feature, but it gets a dishonorable mention. I just like Vampire in Brooklyn. I do. I have no shame about it. It's one of, like, the last 2 Eddie Murphy movies I genuinely liked. I think he does a good job, and they just have fun with the vampire mythos. I mean, not scary at all, but it's a good monster movie, which, horror movies, there is a total area of movies that are just, they're not scary, they're just, we're watching the monster movie, and so it's a lot of fun for that. But in terms of, if you want to pay tribute to Wes like I pay tribute to Wes, you should watch Red Eye, Scream, and the original Nightmare on Elm Street. And I will see you guys next week.